The next movement we're going to discuss under the umbrella of Expressionism is Cubism. I don't know if any of you are old enough to know The Far Side. It's one of my favorite cartoons from when I was young. And I loved how Gary Larson would often deal with art and science in kind of an interesting way. And this is a piece that he did where it kind of puts you in the mind frame of like, what if Pablo Picasso was actually really representing the world around him? So it comes off as this funny joke where, he painted cubism because that's how his family looked, right? But we know that's not true, right? He's painting things as he thinks them, not as he sees them. Cubism, right, was a movement based around Pablo Picasso, who you're seeing here, and Anders Brock, who we'll talk about in a little bit. And Picasso is definitely the more famous of the two. And the outlook that these artists had was this sense of like, how can you break the world apart in what you're painting and what you're sculpting? And so these artists are really, to me, the ideal representation of a fractured world model of why these movements come into being. They're the sense of like fracturing and fragmenting everything around you. I describe cubism to my students as if like we're looking at a mirror and there's an image in the mirror, and then we shove the mirror over and it shatters into like all these shards. And cubism to me is like you try to take all those shards and shove them back together, but it's not going to look like the original. It's going to have, this jaggedness, this pointy edges, right? Images are going to be distorted. That's how I think about cubism. To me, it's the best way to try to describe how it visually looks to me anyway. So this idea of like a fragmented, broken mirror. And I also sometimes talk about cubism as wanting to accomplish the sense of like being able to see all time simultaneously, all time happening at the same point in time. This gets a little metaphysical, but the sense if you could collapse every point in time down to a singular moment, what would a composition look like? If you look at this piece, you'll notice that the women are doing things that physically they can't do. Look at the woman with her head turned around towards you, but her body's crouching and looking away from you. And then, you have figures walking, but then you have figures laying down. So, again, it's almost like all time collapses to a simultaneous point. And in reality, we can't do that. But again, a lot of metaphysicists suggest that that's actually how time is always occurring. We just can't see it that way, right? Um, Again, you can get into like quantum physics and things like that, and your mind will get blown, right? Fourth dimension and all this business. So to me, it's a fractured piece. It's about time collapsing, and that's what Picasso was really playing around with. This is considered the first Cubist piece when Picasso created it in 1912, and really guided the way for the other Cubist pieces on down the road. What's interesting about it is because it's the first piece, it's kind of like, the tryout, the example in a sense. And it does stuff that later Cubism really doesn't do. For instance, it has a very obvious subject that he's using, which is prostitutes. We've seen a lot of courtesans and prostitutes in the class, and notice it's a very typical subject to recycle and use again. So, he's kind of still using recognizable things, things that we can recognize from nature, all the while fracturing them. So I would say you can look at these movements and notice that they all don't operate in the same way. Fauvists are like color centric. Cubists are form, sort of centric. They're form experimenters. So, again, it's not all one way to try to like figure out, what this means for them as they try to start abstracting. They want to abstract their world, right? How are they going to go about it? So again, this piece is kind of traditional on some levels while, breaking the mold in other ways. And it also introduced the idea of primitivism. I've mentioned before that a lot of artists were, very into social causes and social movements. Manet, his Olympia piece was, this idea of commenting about slavery and prostitution, the two animalistic institutions of Europe, as he put it, or France. And here Picasso, he's also sort of messing a bit with colonialism, right, and the French sort of colonialist attitude. And he was inspired, he put it, by objects from non-Western cultures, as we would say. So on the left, you see an Egyptian piece, very famous Menkaure wife from Old Kingdom Egypt. Although, if you really know Egyptian history, it's considered part of the Western canon, even though they're African. And then on the right, you have a traditional African mask. And next to that, you can see the inspiration that you can pull from the painting. If you go back and look at the painting, you'll also notice the idea of the striding figure takes from Egyptian sources. So he's pulling in these non-Western source materials, as he put it, as a way to call people's attention to colonialism, to slavery, these kind of other issues. So again, early Cubism like this, there's still, you'll notice, some recognizable drives behind why Picasso is doing some of this. And I've mentioned the term primitivism before, and it really is about non-Western cultures, Africa, India, right? Things that were lumped in as not the West, not Europe. But this idea of calling them primitive, today, this wouldn't fly, but it's like the term Oriental. Today that wouldn't work out. Oriental is rugs, it's not people, right? And here again, you can really get a sign of the times by thinking about the word primitivism and how it was used. But Picasso really believed strongly that he was actually giving a platform to this kind of art making. He was very interested in the collections of the Musée de l'Homme, or the Museum of Man, that's in Paris. Still today, you can go visit the Museum of Man. And the Museum of Man is filled with all these things that the French took while they colonized, just all these objects. And he would go there and he'd look at these objects and he said, by putting like an African mask into my painting, I was trying to make people think about, these other cultures, and are we doing right by them or are we not? So you'll notice there's a little bit of social commentary in a piece that was the first Cubist work. But when we look at how Cubism develops, it really takes two different paths. One of the primary paths it takes is a very analytical type of Cubism, as it's called. And Braque, the other member of this movement, he tended to go more down the analytical route, right, with his Cubism. And I always tell my students that analytical Cubism is difficult. It's about breaking up the form to the point where you can't even recognize half of what you're supposed to see. For instance, this is supposed to be a portrait of a Portuguese man. Yeah, I'll just leave it for you to think about. And notice the color is stripped down. It's made into a very objective exercise, hence analytical Cubism. But this is where it starts to go. So the early Les Demoiselles piece, right, the Women of Avignon Cubist, sort of experiment, to me, quickly gets turned into a more scientific investigation of these objects, like you see Braque doing here. You also see the birth of collage. And Picasso moved on to doing a lot of collaging as far as Cubism was concerned. If you know Picasso, by the way, he was a part of many different movements. I'm just talking about him in the Cubist movement, but if you know Picasso, there's a lot more there. But he started doing collaging as part of his Cubist interactions, and we call this synthetic Cubism. So analytical, the much more form-driven, kind of experimentation, and then here collaging, taking various items and placing them together to make compositions. If you look at the piece, you'll notice collaging is taking like a piece of sheet music, a piece of wallpaper, a piece of a newspaper, a little drawing, some cardboard, some construction paper, and putting it all together to make what looks like a guitar. So it's using all these disparate items to make the form. And we think that Picasso really loved the play of this. If you notice, he uses some French words in the piece, like the newspapers in France are called journals. So les journaux would be at the top of your, newspaper. And but le jouer in French is a verb for playing. So is he playing with you, right? Or he's playing for himself, he's having fun. And then on the paper, you also see the headline La bataille s'engage, which in French means the battle was joined. So again, is he asking you, come play, come have fun, come see what you can do with this new collaging, right? The freedom of taking all these pieces, these fragments, right, and making them into something larger. So again, collaging is something you see done quite frequently with Cubists as well. And here's another Picasso collage, still life with chair caning. Again, notice the word joue in there, jouer, play. And here you have like some pasteled and painted imagery, a piece of like oilcloth, which is like the chair caning you see, and then the rope as the frame. So a bunch of different disparate elements all kind of, kind of put together to make the piece. We do see sculpture created during the Cubist time period. Here you have Archipenko and Lipschitz. And I like these two together as a contrast because the Archipenko is still somewhat representational to a certain extent. But then you get to the Lipschitz and you're like, wow, that's really, really Cubist. Like, that's really how you fragment a form, how you sort of blow a form apart and start to, it's all angles and chunking of form. It's, again, it's truly, truly Cubist. So you can see the levels of fragmentation that these artists are kind of pushing themselves through as they experiment. The final movement I want to show you is the Futurist movement, very famous for its manifesto, which was written by Marinetti, Filippo Marinetti. And you see a quote from Marinetti here, that a racing car is more beautiful than the victory of Samothrace. Futurists believed quite strongly in just what their name says, the future. And in their manifesto, they write about, invention and speed and electricity and progress. They believe that everything in the past should be left behind. They actually referred to history as like something that kept them back. They thought you should burn down all the museums and destroy history entirely and move forward with a fresh slate. So their whole movement's about progress, invention. If you look at this piece by Boccione, Unique Forms of Continuity in Space, it's about the figure flowing energetically, how to think about a sculpture, of a person moving through time and space. But I also think it has almost this like cyborgian robot kind of feel to it. About something we can't quite grasp or define about invention or progress or movement forward in time. These are people that celebrated the idea of trains and cars. Again, a racing car is more beautiful than the Nike of Samothrace. By the way, that's the Nike of Samothrace if you've never seen it. It is a Hellenistic Greek sculpture, very famous. It lives in the Louvre today. And for someone like Marinetti, he was saying, I'd rather destroy this old piece of Greek sculpture. I'd rather destroy it and have my car because that's progress. That's progression into the future. I don't want to stay in the musty, dusty past. So I actually done a lot of work on the futurists over the course of my life, especially during grad school. And when you're in grad school, you go present papers at a lot of conferences, and I would do presentations on the futurists. Mainly because I just thought they were really interesting, but also I knew they were a hot button movement. Hey, by the way, if you want to get invited somewhere to talk about something, be controversial. It works. So I knew this. So I'd go to give these talks about futurism, and invariably people in the audience during the question and answer session would get so angry. They'd be like, you're defending these killers of history. And I'm like, I'm just talking about them. Like, I'm just telling you who they were, like, well, they're not all right. They were fascists. By the way, they were Italians, and yes, they were operating at the same time as Mussolini. So yeah, a lot of them were fascists. And I'm like, yeah, okay, but this is the art they made. But it was intriguing to me how historians would get really set off and ticked off about these artists and like, how dare you talk about them? And I was like, well, they're pretty damn interesting. If you look at the paintings in the background of this shot of me at the MoMA, you'll notice that these pieces look very cubist almost in a way. So again, a lot of the same vocabulary sometimes shows up in different parts of Expressionism. But again, the futurists were really very focused on this idea of energy, progress, creation. This doesn't mean you don't get a cute painting like Bala's Dog on a Leash. I love this painting, by the way. It's in my top 10 paintings that I would steal. There's something about this cutie cute dog and his little legs and his little tail. I love it. But if you really think about what futurists want to show you, again, remember, all points of time happening simultaneous, energy, motion. There you go, right? But they'd also show you things like, Bala's street light, where I had pointed out the lights in The Night Cafe by Van Gogh, and I said, remember those, because I'll show you something else, a little later on that will, kind of mimic this, and, all these movements were influencing each other in a lot of ways. So, when I look at Streetlight, I see Van Gogh a little bit staring back at me, but I know it's under the futurist mantra of energy, progress, electric lights, right? Motor cars. And again, the futurists were very serious about you should reject the past. You should reject the musty, dusty history. They called museums the sepulchers of art. A sepulcher is a tomb. So they were like, when you go to a museum, you're going to a tomb to see dead things. I love it. It's so crazy, right? And again, as a historian, I'm supposed to not want to talk about this, like, damn those futurists. And I'm like, yeah, but they're so nutty. It's just fantastic. Now, to be honest, futurists didn't really excel as much in the visual arts. If you really want to get into the futurists, you should read their writings, look at some of their experimentations with music. They were kind of a movement that was all over the board with how they created things, right? They're really truly a very humanistic movement because again, they're making things in all different ways. So they're not just purely a visual arts movement. So if you want to know more about them, I definitely think you kind of have to dig deeper, right, into their movement to find out these things. But um, again, if you look at the idea of expressionism, hopefully you notice there's a lot of different ways to be an expressionist, a lot of different movements that you could join in a lot of different, places. But they're always like, how am I inventing? How am I creating? How am I seeing something new? And how am I seeing the world that's around me that's fragmenting? How do I try to make sense of that, right? How do I show you the ideas in my head, right? How do I express what's internal to me? Because that's what to them meant being avant garde, what meant to them that they were creating something new and interesting.